Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Willis. I work in the strategy team at Bromford, and I'm joined by my two colleagues today, John Wade, Director of Strategy, and Paul Taylor, Innovation Coach. Essentially, we'll be running through pretty much 20 to 25 minutes of presentation and then leaving plenty of time for questions, maybe 20 minutes or so, and we'll curate a bit of a Q&A session at the end through that. Yeah, without further ado, I think we'll kick off, shall we? So I think it's important to set a bit of context. Why are we moving to a place-based way of working, John? What's the context within our strategy?
Well, we've had a role called a neighbourhood coach for a number of years, which is, I guess, our newest equivalent to what other people might call a housing officer or a housing manager. And they've been place-based. So we invested in reducing the number of customers that a neighbourhood coach works with from about 500 or 600 down to about 175 each. And each coach works on a discrete number of streets and in a town, working with all of the customers and all of the community assets in that patch. But the rest of the organisation stayed very traditional, very siloed in repairs, lettings, income, etc. And that's really not allowed us to realise the full potential of neighbourhood coaching. And there's still lots of passing things between one team and another, etc. So as we've matured the coaching model, we realised that we really needed to move everything to being place-based and everything to being very relational and through a coaching lens with our customers. So that's the kind of strategic shift that we're looking to make during this strategy.
And kind of, I suppose, viewing it in that context of a strategy that covers 4 to 5 year period, isn't it? So where are we right now in that journey, Paul?
Well, if I just step back from Bromford for a second, I've worked in innovation for 10 years now, and some things we've worked on have been very successful, others not. But if you look at what's going on in health, social care, education, local authority level, there is a system issue problem of kind of rising demand, and the way that we work does not work. And so this strategy was about actually, let's change the system. Let's see what happens and what creativity does changing the system unlock. And we'll go on to where we are in a moment. But in terms of the strategy, coming back to your question, Mark, we deliberately set the strategy up almost like you would set up an innovation strategy to say there'll be a year of discovery, there'll be a year of trial, there'll be a year of mobilising and embedding and then building a next strategy that would also be an innovation strategy. We're in year 2. We're now trialling things out and we're testing some different ways of working and operating. Very, very early stage, but that's where we are at the moment. This is about fundamentally the organisation transforming and hoping that other partners and other organisations will work in similar ways so that we're not going it alone.
I suppose the burning question is, so what is place-based working? Can we give a brief definition of how we see it, Paul?
Yeah, so it's written down there, obviously, but the key points out is that it is person-centred, bottom-up approach. And virtually all organisations will describe themselves as person-centred and having a bottom-up approach, and virtually nobody does actually in practice. So the other thing is it looks at the picture of a system from a local level by working and listening to people who live and work locally. And obviously it builds their strengths, capacity and knowledge. What we're trying to do here is, we'll use that language, but the practice will have to change to follow that language, and the practice must change if we're going to do this properly. So it's a big change for the organisation and it's a big change for our practice.
And along with that change, so like you alluded to there, it's a change in behaviours. So if you do kind of distill place-based working into a key set of practices or principles that underpin how to be person-centred, how to be bottom-up, how does that work, Paul?
I think the first thing is, it's got to be bottom-up, and you've got to resist the need to do things top-down. And I think even in putting together where we are at the moment, there has been an urge for, I'll just use the word management, to kind of interfere and shape and to kind of get their presence overfelt. And what we've had to do is to put a protective shield around it to ensure it remains bottom up. And being bottom up absolutely means you won't have hardly any of the answers to begin with because you haven't even started the conversation. So you can't answer any question because this conversation hasn't started here. And I think that is so strange to organisations in terms of how they've traditionally operated, in terms of we'll have a plan, we'll put that plan together, we'll launch that plan and it will do X, Y, and Z, and it'll be measured at this point, and this point. Genuine place-based working completely upends that. So that's the first principle. The second is that it recognises that one size fits no one. And, if you're looking at places, what's needed in one place will be very different to this place. So if you think of a traditional organisation like Bromford, that what they will want to do ultimately is to operate one system, because one system is easily managed and you'll have this team and this team and this team and they'll do this and they'll deliver it in the same way to a prescribed set of standards. And that might be standards that have been either set by regulation or have been set because of particular types of practice. Place-based working would not follow that model because it is different in different places. Therefore, the way the management system that's around it has to completely alter to reflect that. And I think actually that's one of the reasons people get scared off from doing it, because it sounds like that's going to be chaos. But in reality, of course, we all know that simple ways of working are actually less chaotic than the way a lot of organisations work at the moment. And the next thing I would say is that it's absolutely not about throwing more resources and more cost onto things. This is about working with partners. This is about looking at what's in the place and what can be tapped into. And it should ultimately cost a lot less, really. Place-based working was failing if it's costing more, essentially, or if more resources have been involved. Because my belief, personally, is we have lots and lots of resources. They're just really badly organised, and we can organise what we've all got a lot better to get a lot more positive outcomes.
Great, thanks, Paul. So we've got our principles about how we change the way that we deliver our services. So where have we come across this, John? Where's this idea permeated our thinking?
Well, we've been on a general direction of travel in this way. I say the introduction of neighbourhood coaching, which is our kind of main customer-facing role, has been patch-based for some years. In developing that, we were very interested in the Wigan deal. We did some work with Cormac Russell at Nurture Development, various other organisations, generally outside housing. We know some housing organisations have sort of made some moves in this direction, but picking up Paul's point just now, certainly at least one we're aware of, backed off very quickly from it because the organisation effectively rejected it, like antibodies killing off a virus, and have gone back to working in the more traditional way. So we found a lot of inspiration through attending things like Stronger Things, the community-based conference each year, lots of thinkers, lots of community groups working in this way. As Paul said, voices within health, within education, within the police even. There's a bit of a movement, but it's not quite broken through into the mainstream yet, I would say.
Linked into Paul's point earlier about lots of organisations use the phrases bottom-up, person-centred, don't they? And it means lots of different things to lots of different organisations. So I think, yes, it's not a brand new idea, is it? But actually, within housing, we don't think it's particularly been tried before in this way, do we?
No, I mean, those that we're more aware of who've done something like this at any kind of scale have, like us, mostly focused on the kind of housing officer type role and made that place-based, but pretty much left everything else in the organisation as it was. There are others sort of exploring this. We've been doing some sharing of thinking and ideas with HAFOD, for instance, and there are some in the Black Country who are exploring these sort of ideas. So we're not claiming we're unique, but what is different this time for us certainly is, as Paul's saying, we want to not just have these as words that we wrap around a fairly traditional way of working. We want this to actually mean something and be really bottom up and really place-based.
Just building on that, so in making sure that it's bottom up, how do we make sure that kind of some of the other stigmas or paternalistic viewpoints that are sometimes characterised in the housing sector, how do we avoid that becoming the way that we view place-based working? How do we stop it being we're purely doing this to solve problems or to reduce the amount of repairs that we get? How do we set the tone to make sure that this is, a positive experience for colleagues and, more importantly, for our customers and community?
I mean, this slide is one we've used for a while. It's a typical sort of slide that you might get in any social sector organisation, housing, health, local authorities, police, they nearly all look out on the world, whether that's a town, a district, a city, and view it through the lens of deficits, mapping misery, as we'll put it on this slide. It's you look at heat maps of where there's the greatest incidence of child poverty or child abuse or addiction or whatever it is. And that does permeate so much of housing. And unwittingly, that then influences the way we often relate to the people living in our homes. The Grenfell report has highlighted that big time. The Housing Ombudsman has highlighted it. It's not intentional, but it creeps into our language, our thinking, the way we design services. We don't trust people. We want to double check everything. We don't assume that people are just like us. And if they report a repair, it's because they need a repair doing. They're not trying to get one over on us or get something done that they're not entitled to or whatever. So it's baked into much of the sector, this kind of view of the world. So place-based working and neighbourhood coaching has helped us a lot with this, is giving a housing organisation a way of actually seeing the communities where people live. We see them through the lens of our organisation as assets, by which we mean buildings that we own, rather than seeing the richness of community groups, community associations, the skills and interests and passions that everyone living in a community has, and how they all interrelate and work with each other. There are hundreds, thousands of community assets that are invisible generally to people working in housing. So, you get the whole housing hero mentality, that we see a world that's a map of misery and cast ourselves as coming in to help make everything fine again. By working with a team based in a place, getting to know the people in that place, getting to know the community much better, being visible, they very, very quickly have a completely different view of that community than perhaps their wider organisation has. And they see the strengths and see the potential in that place and hear about what's going on there, so they can really help push back into the organisation and demand resources, control, decision-making. We had an event yesterday where we shared some of what's been going on in our first pilot. It sounds fairly obvious, but I think Paul used the phrase, no decision that affects a place should be made outside the place. People are making decisions in offices hundreds of miles away who've never been to a place, but they're deciding whether that place should or shouldn't have some money invested in it. So it's really turning everything upside down.
Yeah, and like you say, turning everything upside down in terms of that power and influence on decision-making, but also how we organise ourselves to deliver that as well, Paul, isn't it?
Yeah, so we are at the very early stages. We've identified roughly how many places would operate across Bromford. So we've got the kind of modelling for the future, and that's defined upon how communities see places rather than just how Bromford see places. And we have got our first, we're referring to it a pilot, but it really is an exploration of a team based in Staple Hill in South Gloucestershire that we have assembled. And what we've done very briefly, because we're going to do a specific session on this with the team involved that will follow in November, is we've just taken all the team that operate in a place outside their silos. So neighbourhood coaches that John's referred to now will work alongside our engineers, will work alongside our cleaners and caretakers and landscapers and people who work in older persons accommodation or independent living. And what we've basically done is to say, right, our hypothesis is, wouldn't things work a lot better if these weren't managed in different silos and they were put together under a place lead who is responsible for bringing out all those connections within the place, not just with obviously internal teams, but with local councillors, the NHS, the local authority, to bring that alive into that place and only basically speak to the internal teams when they're needed, essentially. So they'll be the broker. So what the first kind of test is really about is about, let's assemble those colleagues in the place and let's see what happens and let's see what practice emerges. And we'll then decide what we do with what I'll call the enabling teams. So the teams on the right-hand side of this graphic. And we're basically saying, you now operate as a kind of cross-functional team that actually is thinking about solving problems, that's not restricted by the internal bureaucracies of the organisation. Get on with it. And it's really interesting. And we'll get the team together for the next webinar in November. I'm in their chat. I don't take part in it, but I just look over it on a daily basis. All these people solving problems around a place, but also spotting opportunities, spotting things that previously they wouldn't have done, stepping outside their job profile, not thinking about their job profile, but thinking about the place. Very, very early stages. We're in week 8 of it as it stands at the moment, but we've seen some really transformative stuff. This is about changing the system and thinking about the model, So Angela, who I think she'll be on the next webinar, she's kind of the lead for bringing this together in the first area. We've said this isn't a traditional management model because it's not management. It's about connection. It's not about managing things. It's actually about bringing things together and connecting dots and spotting opportunities. And equally, there's a whole different support function behind that I think that needs to happen. So rather than teams, as John said, making decisions when they're outside the place, the decisions need to be made in the place. And I think that needs some really joined up thinking and process, and actually needs some kind of a different way of working. And we've put a kind of agile planner within the actual team to help out with some of that stuff. And that, in effect, is changing the system as well, because it's putting the locus of control back in the place and taking it away from the hierarchy, ultimately. So we're seeing some really interesting things in the first phase, and that's continuing. And we're having a second phase that will launch in November.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Paul. And I suppose, we've all been involved in that planning process to get that first pilot off the ground, and indeed taking the learnings from that into the launch of the second pilot. So perhaps you could talk a little bit around that process, John. What are the the challenges that we faced in that process, both logistically, potentially also a bit bigger picture with trying to transform the way that business operates, isn't it? And we revert to type sometimes. So can you talk through maybe a couple of the challenges in changing people's thinking?
So, I think, like most big organisations, we're self-obsessed. We tend to spend most of our time talking to other bits of our own organisation, which is kind of almost the opposite end of the spectrum from being truly place-based. So we're doing a lot to try and disrupt that and get leaders and others to look outside the organisation, encourage people to, bringing people in to speak, getting people out to meet people outside the organisation, being much more open in involving customers in all kinds of levels of the organisation. So that's really difficult because people constantly want to go back to their comfort zone of their team, their bit of a team, having meetings in our internal offices. So that's a big challenge. Personalisation, Paul talked about one size fits all. The sector is kind of infected by the kind of Taylorist idea of efficiency and sort of have one way of doing things, make it really, really efficient, and that's going to give you value for money. In fact, we're pretty hopeless at doing that, as Grenfell and the new regulation regime that's had to be put in has shown. Actually, we've got a very small but had a massive impact kind of data science team who are starting to say, no, you've got loads of data, tons and tons of data. There's loads that you can do, lots of questions you can answer that you didn't think you could answer. That means actually you can personalize what you do and how you deliver services. And if you can harness that to relational workers on the ground who are seen, visible, trusted, known, but equip them with, state-of-the-art data intelligence as well, then that can be a really powerful combination. So there's lots of stuff that we're doing around sort of segmentation and using data. Again, Paul mentioned it, but being comfortable with this. You don't build the perfect place-based model in a room in Tewkesbury and then unleash it to the whole world and it works from week 2. We don't know how to do this. This is a wicked problem. We're having to work out what works, what doesn't work, what we need to adjust, what we need to change as we go. And so it is going to iterate, and each pilot will be different and each place team will probably be slightly different. And some of the benefits that we expect to get or hope to get might take years. So, we've got to be really comfortable with that. This is a long-term shift. It's a cultural shift as much as anything. The last challenge is trying to get leaders, senior leaders, not to see this as a distraction from the much more important work of BAU, the day job. This is the important stuff. This is the stuff that hopefully is going to transform the way we work and have a very positive benefit for the people living in our homes, the places where they live, the communities they live in. Yeah, it is challenging. You're trying to swim upstream and hitting all kinds of internal barriers, intended and unintended.
Absolutely. So everybody wants to finish on a slightly brighter note. So once we've done that, Paul, once all the challenges have been surmount it? What's the big picture vision for where we will end up once place-based working is embedded and a big success?
Well, you've asked me to be cheerful, but the way we work does not work. We had a leaders' day yesterday, actually. I think for the first time, there was a kind of realization, this is broken, but actually there's something happening over here that could be transformational. And I think when we talk about the vision, we've got to be really careful about setting a Bromford vision, because it's not Bromford's vision to have. It's the vision of the people in those places and the people working in those places. My vision is realising whatever their vision is, essentially, and what works in that place and for those people. But I think if I talk for our colleagues, I think a much less complicated, less bureaucratic, less top-down, less kind of red tape inbound way of working, and applying that to other sectors and to working with other sectors. I'm already looking at that Staple Hill team and thinking, why can't we get someone from the NHS in there? Why can't we get someone from social care in there? And thinking about that and, letting them self-organise and solve problems with help from enabling teams, as I say, because they'll need help to get over those challenges. But I think it's their vision.
Absolutely. And I think that comes back to that very first point we make about it being bottom up, isn't it? You can't instill a vision onto or project a vision onto from elsewhere. It needs to come from within. So I think that's a great place to finish. And there's been a few questions already. There's one here, how to make communities more visible. This is from Sky. How might we go about kind of building those partnerships with external stakeholders, moving away from kind of fixing problems, that working with external partners, that we might be able to create a map of happiness instead of a map of misery? John, do you want to start on that?
Well, I think the starting point so far from our one pilot is beginning to build stronger relationships, place-based relationships with a range of people within, in this case, South Gloucestershire Council, starting conversations with people within health, with various groups that work in the community-run groups, so that it's not our team and our customers within that community, it's the community talking about the community and what's working well, and helping give more voice to the community through those organisations so that they gradually affect the way that those various organisations perceive that community, and they all play that supportive service role rather than each looking at the place really as a set of problems for their organisation to solve. So I think it's going to be very gradual. It's certainly not going to happen overnight, but it's a great way of framing it, a map of happiness.
Anything to add there, Paul?
No, I think it's a great question from Sky. And I think just building on what John said at the end, it won't happen overnight because we've got to get the teams working that way first to unleash that and thinking that. And I think some of that is around the teams will work that naturally, but management won't work like that naturally because we've got to stop management from managing and we've moved to a connected model. So that will absolutely flow. The other thing I'd add to what John said is, I think it's really important to start the conversation probably more strategically with the local authorities at the same time. So you're doing the kind of bottom-up work, but you can't just do bottom-up and expect that's going to change everything, because if you've got strategic management that's not bought into it, if you've got your board not bought in or senior leaders not bought in, it's going to kill it straight off when we've seen that. So for instance, South Gloucestershire, so where Sky lives, we're having partnership conversations to kind of partnership board level with the local authority who are also really up for place-based working. So what we can start doing is together shifting away from that kind of misery mapping exercise to let's look at that strength-based approach. That's really important to align with organisations who share the belief, because if people don't believe in this stuff, it's not going to happen because it's hard work.
I can see a question from Adrian in the chat in response to what we've just been talking about. You're right, Adrian, this isn't about us or any other statutory or agencies telling a different story to the world about a place, but it is about us hopefully changing our own internal organisational perspectives and views as they look out on the world. That's the bit we can take responsibility for. How do we interact with a place? And if we're working with other agencies and they're going through a similar exercise, hopefully it's much more about removing blockers, barriers, so that the place can, it's perfectly capable of shouting about what it's doing and what its priorities and whatever are. It's not us doing it, it's us getting out of the way.
Absolutely. It leads into another question asked by Matthew. So they're on a similar journey of trying to create these new community indicators. So take a view on a community over kind of a 10-year horizon, not viewing it through a deficit model, but coming up with kind of a positive vision. I assume that's kind of alongside kind of input from the communities themselves. So how are we trying to build in a model-based approach to this? Paul?
We're starting deliberately slowly because we want to ensure that we do this right, and it's guided, as we say, bottom up. So we've got a hypothesis of how many places we'll have, essentially, and we're starting off with 4 test areas, first of all, to explore that, as I said earlier. Going back to the question, I think one of the things is that, we've got to identify, what is our kind of role within that place. Adrian's just made the point in the chat about getting out of the way, and he's right. A lot of this is just about getting out of the way. However, there's some areas where we are much more of a strategic partner, where we've got the vast majority of the rented housing, in some cases up to kind of 80% or something like that. So there, we absolutely need to develop those much longer term visions, because we're much more of a key player, an anchor within that place. South Gloucestershire is a good example. And that's where we need to be thinking about what does that kind of model look like, that happiness map, if you like, over a much longer period of time. But in other places, I don't think it will be like that. We're assembling a kind of third test phase at the moment that will be in a local authority area where we're not a dominant player. And that model, I think, will be completely different in terms of what we outlined at Staple Hill, because that will be, I think, to go back to Adrian's point, let's assemble a team that can do pretty much anything and the rest of the organisation gets out the way. So the models will be very different. But as I say, we're early stages of forming a hypothesis around that.
I think it's fair to say that we are cautious about the idea of too many measures and metrics that imply that what we do, frankly, at all in Staple Hill is of big enough significance that it is going to transform everything about that place. There's massive inequality in our country. There's lots of things happening to public services, cuts that have been going on for decades. So we don't want to try and measure everything, weigh everything, and attribute too much to what we're doing. We've got a Thrive Index that we've developed that is mostly using TSM measures and some ONS data. We've been looking quite closely at the Co-op Wellbeing Index, which again uses mostly sort of publicly available data sets. And they too are very cautious about suggesting that you can put a few interventions into a place and miraculously see those ONS type figures change and attribute it to your intervention. So we're going to be pretty light touch, I think, on that area. It's going to be more relational and less kind of targets and measures.
So yeah, on that, it's exactly that. We've got a baseline. We know what our performance is like in that area. And I think Rishi asked that in the chat earlier. And we'll be really cautious about how we kind of attribute what we do. But if taking it back to basics, we know how our colleagues feel about how they work. And we've done a specific survey before we started this work about where they are. And if you look at the local team where they were, they didn't feel that we all acted as an organisation as one team. They didn't feel that they had enough autonomy in their roles to try out new things. They didn't think their ideas could be realised. So if we go to about baselines, and I'm coming from an innovation perspective here, how can you improve anything if your colleagues and the people you work with feel like that they don't have the ability to change it? And so that, to me, is one of the most important baselines of all, because if we can fix that, everything else should flow from it.
Absolutely. There's a question here from Alison, which is talking about, or asking a question about the management structures and how do we retain the specialist knowledge in specific areas like compliance, housing management and maintenance, etc., when you have such a diverse team all under one leader who is not an expert in all those things. And she kind of answers her own question, I suppose, there with asking if it's a matrix management system, which indeed it is.
It is. And, it's a great question and one that not surprisingly gets asked whenever we talk about this internally as well. And we haven't got a pat, clever answer to it. It's an emergent strategy. It's going to have to evolve and we're going to have to learn as we move out. So at the moment, it's dead easy because there's only one place team. In South Gloss, we think we'll have 8 places, which will provide most of our services in South Gloucestershire. So that is going to have some big disruptive effect on the way we're currently organised in South Gloucestershire, for instance. Exactly how we'll respond to that and what it will look like, we don't know. What we do know is we can't get to a place where we've lost all connection to understanding health and safety responsibilities and compliance responsibilities and employment law responsibilities, but others have managed to move in this direction. Birdsall obviously is talked about a lot. Timpson is something we talk about a lot, that kind of upside down management. There are ways of doing it. What is exactly going to be the right way for us and our geography and our kind of industry, we don't know yet. But yeah, that'll be coming further down the tracks.
That's something that we will explore in an upcoming phase, because that whole question that Alison poses, I think, is a really, really important one. And my question would be, how many of those specialist teams with specific areas are truly specialist, or are they things that we have assembled in our kind of legacy ways of working? They're almost like organizational debt that we've built up over time that we think we have to do, that could become done differently if we operate in a place-based way.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of related questions here. So the question from Barbara it's in relation to our possible merger with Flagship. How are we trying to mitigate the risk that Bromford becomes ever more centralised as we get bigger, which obviously is direct conflict with a place-based model? And related to that, I think, kind of as part of the answer, Sky's asking, would specialisms develop within geographically concentrated areas where specific issues are identified?
I mean, again, very good questions. There's a lot of interest at Flagship in place-based working. They've got a slightly different model, and it was one of the kind of few key principles of the two organisations coming together was to embrace and continue to be focused on moving to a place-based way of working. Paul and I are actually going to exchange emails this week, but we're going over to speak to Flagship's board about place-based working, and we might look to extend some of the pilots into Flagship's operating area. Let's see, but it's at the heart of the partnership, so hopefully it's going to remain a key part, and making sure that things are not over-centralised is what place-based is all about, as Paul said earlier.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for so many great questions. We have run out of time. I will bring this to a close. Just to say, this webinar is part of a series. We are going to be running more webinars. The next one, the date is already set. So looking at place-based working in practice, and that's going to be looking in depth at our first pilot, which is in the Staple Hill area in South Gloucestershire. And so we'll be talking to the team, talking about how this has been working in practice, what it's been like working under a place-based model, teething problems, all the successes, and all that kind of stuff. So thank you so much for coming along. Do make sure you sign up to that. More to come in the place-based space at Bromford. Bye-bye.